and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Mirion and it's time for another monthly reading wrap-up. In the month of May, I read 6 books in total, 4 novels and 2 books of non-fiction. Well, 1 book of non-fiction and 1 graphic novel. This time around, I'm going to talk about the 2 non-novels first and then follow through with the 4 novels I read. So at the beginning of the month, I read L'Enfant Interdit, comment la pédophilie est devenue scandaleuse by Pierre Verdrager. This is a book about the history of the pro-pedophilia movement that gathered quite a bit of steam in the 1970s, 1980s, basically following May 68 or the, social and sexual liberation of the late 1960s. This was written by a sociologist, so this takes a sociological look at that phenomenon, though obviously it incorporates elements of history as well in the analysis of those events. Absolutely disgusting subject matter, as you can imagine, but very interesting. Disturbingly eye-opening is how I'm going to put it. So as a sociological piece of work, the author tries, and quite frankly succeeds, in staying very neutral when he presents the arguments that were used by the pro-pedophilia movement back in those decades. When presenting an argument for sexual relationships between adults and minors, he doesn't interject, disgusted reactions. He just presents the arguments, presents why the pro-pedophilia movement used the arguments they did, what kind of effect that had, how convincing they were to a more general population, in the media, in the intellectual spheres of mostly France, though it does take a look at the same movement all around Europe, even in the States a little bit. So it does have a bit of an international reach, though the focus is definitely Franco-centric. So that's also a point in favor of this book, because I was afraid it was really going to focus in too much on France. But no, a lot of this stuff was going on in all of the West, basically, and all of the pro-pedophilia movements, whether in the UK, the US, France, Germany, Belgium, they all kind of use the same arguments. And then it also presents the counter-arguments that were, propped up to combat this movement. Now, one of the political left's dark legacies is that a lot of political activists on the left at the time were in favor of this movement because to them it was an extension of basically the impetus towards liberation, social and moral liberation in all spheres of life. So liberation from patriarchy, from capitalism, from exploitative labor. But then they applied this to childhood sexuality, some people did. Though one notable exception to this, guess who were the loudest voices contesting this pro-pedophilia movement on the left? It was the feminists! Yes, thank you. Obviously, there are exceptions to this as well. There have been feminist activists who took a weird stance in that regard, but mostly the people who were opposed to all these essays coming out in the newspapers, to all these ideas for reforming education legislation, were feminist activists, because women were concerned with rape culture, sexual violence, and the family and the domestic sphere, and thus children, and so they felt more responsible towards protecting children as well. Another interesting little anecdote, though, is that nowadays some people who critique the left and point to this stuff, with reason, mind you, forget that people on the political right as well were defending pedophilia. It's very weird. So both the left and the right, elements on the left and the right, were pro-pedophilia and tried to legalize sexual relationships between adults and minors/children, though they used different arguments. On the left, it was more from the standpoint of liberation and child liberation. On the right, though, the argument put forward was the idea of discipline, of educating children in a very strict manner, but incorporating sexuality within said education. So actually kind of riffing off of pederasty in antiquity, though even that was very much misunderstood by the pro-pedophilia movement. Another funny little anecdote, a lot of references are pulled in this book, literary ones, academic ones, journalistic ones. A name that comes up again and again and again is that of Gabriel Matzneff, whom I've talked about in a previous memoir review for Le Consentement/Consent by Vanessa Springroth. That guy who now is on trial for promoting pedophilia in writing, well, he was a big player in the pro-pedophilia movement of those decades. So, that was interesting. The guide, his research, there's a very thick bibliography at the back. Lots of sources are cited. It's a thorough examination of that phenomenon. The guy did a great job. I also appreciated the fact that the author presented his methodology, explained the big currents in sociological and historical analysis, which one he was trying to go for, though at times I felt he repeated that methodology a bit too much. After 2 or 3 times, you kind of get how he's conducting his research. You didn't need to repeat it that many times. Then the one graphic novel I read in May was C'est comme ça que je disparais by Mirion Malle. This is basically a graphic novel about a young woman going through severe depression and describing depression as ceasing to exist, disappearing, and becoming disconnected from her emotions and the savor of life. And I'm being a bit generous here because honestly, I didn't think it was that deep. Never really understand why the main female character is chronically depressed the way she is. I mean, you kind of get an inkling towards the very end of the book, but as such, that was very rushed and it's kind of dropped at the end and you're like, but tell me more? I don't know, it was very slow and you do see the main character feeling very distraught, crying a lot, being depressed. I get that. I understand what that's like. But I don't know. Overall, there wasn't much to it, honestly. It was fairly superficial, so fairly disappointing. I've read much deeper and more impactful things, whether in graphic or prose format, regarding depression and mental illness. For more info on that, I invite you to check out one of the videos I did to mark May as Mental Health Awareness Month. And now on to the novels. First, I read A Natural History of Dragons by Mary Brennan. What's funny about this is that I had originally bought this 4 years ago in hardback, but it was a period of my life when I compulsively bought a lot of books and then ended up unhauling 3/4 of them unread. And A Natural History of Dragons was among them. And then I was like, oh, but you know what? I love dragons and I should check this out. So I did, so I rebought it in paperback format. So A Natural History of Dragons basically takes place in an alternative version of 19th century Europe / the world. So it's not alternative history, but basically the setting sounds a crap ton like 19th century Victorian England / Europe. And the main character wants to become are they called dragonologist? Draconologist? I cannot remember, but she wants to study dragons because dragons are real animals in that version of reality. And, well, since she's a girl and lives in a society extremely similar to that of 19th century Victorian England, it's expected of her to get married and keep a household and not go around, studying dragons in the wild and doing unladylike things, but she does anyway. It was neat. It was neat in the sense that you root for the main female character overcoming the gendered boundaries placed upon her, and you do have dragons and studying dragons, but there weren't enough dragons for my taste, not enough draconological things, basically. I wanted more biology on the dragons, more taxonomy, all that good shit I love as a zoology nerd, as a biology nerd, and a dragon nerd, obviously. It was, more than anything else, just the story of this young woman overcoming the barriers placed on her because of her sex. As you could get in basically an adventure following a heroine from our world in the 1800s. It was a solid 7 out of 10, or between a 6.5 and a 7 out of 10. I enjoyed it. It was a fairly relaxing read. I did enjoy the little bits of dragon biology you do get in there, but it wasn't dragon-centric enough for my taste, basically. So I'm not sure I'm going to continue with this series. I know that this is book 1 in a series of, 6 books at this point. Perhaps the dragonology becomes more prominent in the following volumes, but as of now, I'm going to leave this to the side. I enjoyed this first little taste, but not quite enough to make me want to continue with the series. Then I read The Girl with All the Gifts by Emma Carey. So I'm going to say something which some people apparently on Goodreads consider a spoiler. Apologies, but I do not consider this a spoiler given that you learn what this is really about about 10 to 20 pages in. So basically, this is a zombie book. And the particularity of the zombies in this story is that they're shroom zombies. And by that, I mean that the pathogen that zombifies people is a modified version of the cordyceps fungus, which I found hilarious. I did enjoy that bit, just to be clear. I didn't really like this book overall, but I did enjoy that bit. The thing is, that's the base premise of The Last of Us, the video game, which I haven't yet played, but will because I now have a PlayStation 4. Very excited about that. But yeah, it's the base premise of The Last of Us. So, not that original. I mean, no one owns, copyright on cordyceps zombies, right? But The Last of Us did come out before this came out. So I'm like, you do not get the originality point there, mate. And I find it hilarious because this is directly referenced in this novel, and it was referenced in a making of video I watched concerning The Last of Us. I don't know how many people were traumatized by that episode of Planet Earth on the BBC. You know which episode I mean. If you've watched that documentary series, you know the episode I mean. The episode in the Amazonian rainforest where you see cordyceps mushrooms brainwashing and mind-controlling ants to commit suicide. So it kind of just made me laugh that it directly inspired two IPs. So this is a zombie flick in book form. In my opinion, not even that good of a zombie flick, to be quite honest. You start the book out with this girl called Melanie who is being brought up in this weird compound. She's being attached to a wheelchair to be taken to a classroom and then brought back to the cell where she sleeps. And to be fair, that beginning section of the book is quite good. But again, apologies, but I do not think this is a spoiler because basically 20 pages in, she references that she hears the grown-ups around her, which include military personnel, wink wink, talking about hungries. And I'm like, well, of course there's gonna be fucking zombies, because this is also, a massive trope. You never actually call zombies in fiction zombies. You call them something else like walkers, hungries, whatever else, I can't remember. What are they called in 28 Days Later? I can't remember, whatever. And the girl, again, I do not consider this a spoiler, the girl is basically a zombie, but a zombie who's retained her consciousness, her intelligence, because she's also intellectually gifted, and her humanity, I guess. That's the base idea. She's being brought up in this compound, and those first 100 pages of the novel are pretty good. And then stuff happens. If you're at all familiar with zombie cinematography, zombie literature, you kind of know what's going to happen. I saw most of this book coming from miles away, which is fine. At first, I thought it was funny. Towards the end, though, I just got more and more annoyed and angry because it's not a very good zombie flick. There are plot holes the size of black holes, as far as I'm concerned, and just god's awful female characterization once again. Like, you've got the evil bitch female scientist who wants to save humanity, but of course, the way she wants to do it lacks 100% empathy and stuff like that. And you've got the nice woman who's an idiot. Oh my god, she was so effing stupid. I wanted her to get eaten by zombies because she was such an effing moron, but she's like the nice woman who is friendly to the zombie girl. So I guess you're supposed to root for her, but I just couldn't get over how moronic she was. And then you have like the military guy, who I kind of liked, but of course he's got these random creepy sexual thoughts, because of course you need to have those in a story about survival and being ripped to shreds by zombies. And of course, you have these tantalizing bits of world building which never go anywhere, because why would they? I'm expecting the storyline and the world building of The Last of Us to be 1,000 times better than that of The Girl with All the Gifts. So, yeah. A book about shroom zombies. A mixture of The Last of Us, The Walking Dead, 28 Days Later, and perhaps Warm Bodies. Like I said, if you're familiar, like I am, with zombie media, skip this one and pick up something that'll just be better. Watch a movie that'll be better, or play The Last of Us, as I will soon enough. And then I finally got around to reading Hyperion and the Fall of Hyperion by Dan Simmons. So the first half, or I guess the first arc of the Hyperion cantos. And I loved these. Wow, they were good. Once again, just top tier. Absolutely top tier, brilliant, beautiful science fiction, maybe veering towards science fantasy, a bit like Dune. I actually preferred this to Dune. Don't get me wrong, the first Dune trilogy I still maintain. Brilliant science fiction / science fantasy, but this kind of tops it. Honestly, I just gave a 9 out of 10 to The Fall of Hyperion, and Hyperion itself is kind of an 8 to an 8.5 out of 10. I thought it was better written, for one thing. Moreover, it's seeded with so many literary references and cultural references. And I mean, there is a literary reference that is at the heart of the narrative and the story's development. If you're familiar with John Keats's work, then you would have picked up on the fact it's called the Hyperion Cantos. It's a direct reference to John Keats's work, which I didn't know. I'm slightly familiar with John Keats, but not enough, clearly. I thought the character work was overall quite a bit better as well. And the theming and the world building, just as deep, in my opinion, as that you find in Dune. However, what I noticed is that in Dune, it just smacks you in the face. The political theming, the religious theming, the ecological world building is very potent, very in your face, like it's imposing. In the case of the Hyperion Cantos, it's more something that slowly creeps up on you and just slowly envelopes you and fills you up with just a sense of, wow, what did I just read? This was amazing. It's more gradual, it's more subtle, but just as layered, just as deep. It hits you differently, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It hits you differently. And I guess I preferred the delivery of the Hyperion Cantos, the first arc of it. I will be doing a full video review for both of these. At this point in time, I don't think I'm going to continue on with Endymion and the Rise of Endymion because, well, for one thing, I've read that it's not as good as these first two, that there might be a bit of retconning going on. And I mean, the threads of world building and narrative, potential narrative development in The Fall of Hyperion that are left unresolved. And I'm a completionist bitch. So I tend to want to know how it all ends and to get as many explanations to things going on as I can. However, without spoiling anything, time travel or, bending space and time does come up in this story. And the thing with time travel is that it has to be done very carefully for it to work. For me, it can very easily flop and go very weird and unconvincing places, I guess. So I'm a bit wary about that. I'm like, but what if I continue it I like weird, but what if it gets too weird and just jumps off the cliff? Kind of like it did with Dune. I was so happy with the way things mostly wrapped up in The Fall of Hyperion. I had great satisfaction with most of the character arcs, with the main narrative arc, with the main themes, the world building. I want to keep that sense of satisfaction and wonderment and amazement. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm not going to risk it at this point in time. Perhaps one day I'll finish it for the sake of it, or perhaps I'll cheat and go read synopses on the internet because I do that as well sometimes. So that wraps up the month of May, which was again a bit hectic to be perfectly honest, and today I had a hard day, so I'm actually fairly tired. But in the month of June, this is the lovely thing about finally getting a subscription to my local library. I basically didn't have to buy a single book for my June TBR. So actually, I'm not just going to talk about my June TBR, I'm going to show you some of them because I won't have most of these books at the end of June when I film my June reading wrap-up. So this month I'm going to read Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. The movie adaptation is one of my all-time favorites and classics. In fact, it's the very first movie I ever saw. I'm going to read a classic of American literature, The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And the next one I kind of picked on a whim. I had heard of it. Again, has to do with, exploitative sexual situations and re-examining the past, blah, 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 but a bit differently, I think. Something called Trust Exercise by Susan Choi. They had this at my library. I was like, I actually know what this is. It's fairly short. All right, I'm taking it. That's the risky thing about having a library subscription. It's like, oh, look at all these books I can take for basically free. This is so fun. But I have to remember that I can only read so much in any given amount of time. And I actually miscalculated what I took from the library because basically I'm going to have to rush read through a couple of these if I want to take them back to the library on time, which was incredibly stupid of me, but oh. so be it. And then I'll be rereading something I first read a few years ago. It's called You by Joanna Briscoe. Again, features a questionable relationship, which at the time I loved for the wrong reasons. So I want to reread it to see what I'm going to make of it now that some things have massively shifted in my life, in my memory, with my mental health, etc., etc. And then I'll throw in some nonfiction, some graphic fiction and or nonfiction. Oh yes, and I am going to read Beren and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien, which isn't a constructed narrative like The Children of Hurin is, which I have read, but illustrations by Alan Lee, am I right? And, you know, having a nice little collection of those illustrated Tolkien editions. Am I right? But one of the rules I have is I have to read all the books in my library, barring reference books, so I'm going to read through it. So I'm basically going to be reading X versions of Beren Luthien as it was developed over time by J.R.R. Tolkien. So that's going to be interesting, but it's not that long, so it'll be fine. And again, illustrations by Alan Lee. Am I right? So on that note, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you in the next video, which will undoubtedly be my Hyperion review. Bye-bye!